still believe that we could have achieved our 1941 campaign 11 objectives had it not been for the pernicious interventions of V/Adolf Hitler, the most fundamental of which resulted in the Battle of Kiev. The consequences of military victory would have been a matter for conjecture, since Hitler's goal was the conquering of Lebensraum, and this implied the total destruction of the Russian state. We in the General Staff, on the other hand, had come around to envisaging a more moderate and realistic political solution, in which a Russia would continue to exist. We had realized that this vast country, rich in manpower and raw material resources, could in the final analysis only be conquered, or rather liberated from communism, with the help of the Russian peoples themselves. And this is how, even after the setbacks of the winter campaign of 1941–42, we could still have succeeded had the war been gently directed. We could have won the Russians over because of their instinct for national self-preservation alone, quite apart from their pent-up hatred of communism in general and the Stalinist system in particular. But Hitler refused to believe this whenever the possibility was put to him. It is in Hitler's failure to exploit the psychological potential of the Russian peoples, most of whom had shown the greatest warmth toward us in the opening phases of the campaign, that we can see the real mistake he made. We can see it again in the brutal way he imposed his satraps Koch, Sauckel, and Kube on the conquered Russian provinces, and converted the people's frustrated hopes into blind hatred of the Germans. These mistakes counted more heavily against us than many a strategic blunder, because Hitler had stirred up moral feelings. Unlike the wars of earlier times, modern wars are basically wars between peoples. The wars of the 18th century were fought between the armed forces of the combatant states. Modern wars are fought by the people as such, who must bear the necessary sacrifice and involve themselves body and soul in their cause. In particular, the modern world is divided into two diametrically opposed ideological camps, the free world and international communism, and from this there springs a more intense and fun, mentally emotional aggravation of the otherwise purely military conflict. Hitler and Stalin always emphasized the ideological aspect, and even Eisenhower titled his memoirs Crusade in Europe, in deference to the convictions of many British and Americans. I do not believe the near future will see any change in the respective roles of war and ideology, nor do I believe politics, and hence wars, can ever be divested of their ideological character. However ugly the prospect may be, there always will be wars in the years to come. The teachings of Mao, of Che Guevara, and of Giap tell us so, as does a study of the work on military strategy by Marshal of the Soviet Union Sokolovsky, which reflects the official attitude of the Soviet Union toward war and politics. It is this extension of war to every facet of human activity that obliges us to see its essentially political character, as the military strategist Karl von Clausewitz demonstrated in his famous thesis on war. While political goals shape war and influence it from one moment to the next, it is the soldier's duty to ensure that he will not be confronted with insoluble tasks by his political leaders, as Happ penned in June 1941. Political leaders should do what they can at every stage to ease the soldier's task by bringing both political and psychological weapons into play. This was the victory that we, the General Staff, aspired to with the help of Russian officers and men recruited from among the prisoners in our hands, and this was what we were denied by our political leaders. In retrospect, we can only agree that it is a matter for regret that Hitler, unlike Lenin, who is known to have studied Clausewitz from the numerous marginalia that have survived in his hand, did not follow the master's teach. Ings more closely and act accordingly. Clausewitz stated that war is only a continuation of state policy by other means. War is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. Violence, that is to say, physical force, for there is no moral force without the conception of states and law, is therefore the means, the compulsory mission of the enemy to our will is the ultimate object. In order to attain this object fully, the enemy must be disarmed, and disarmament therefore becomes the immediate object of hostilities in theory. It takes the place of the final object and puts it aside as something we can eliminate from our calculations. After going in greater detail into the aims, objects, and motives of war, Clausewitz comes to the following conclusion. The war of a community, of whole nations and particularly of civilized nations, always starts from a political condition and is called forth by a political motive. It is therefore a political act. Now, if it was a perfect, unrestrained and absolute expression of force, as we had to deduce it from its mere conception, then the moment it is called forth by policy, it would step into the place of policy, and as something quite independent of it would set it aside, and only follow its own laws. War in the real world is not an extreme thing which expends itself at one single discharge. It is the opera. Triad of powers which do not develop themselves completely in the same manner and in the same measure, but which at one time expand sufficiently to overcome the resistance posed by inertia or friction, while at another they are too weak to produce an effect. It is therefore, in a certain a pulsation of violent force more or less vehement, sequently making its discharges and exhausting its powers more or less quickly, in other words, conducting more or less quickly to the aim, but always lasting long enough to admit of influence being exerted on it in its course, so as to give it this or that direction, in short, to be subject to the will of a guiding intelligence. Now, if we reflect that war has its root in a political object, then naturally this original motive which called it into existence should also continue the first and highest consideration in its conduct. Still, the political object is no despotic lawgiver on that account. It must accommodate itself to the nature of the means, and though changes in these means may involve modification in the political objective, the latter always retains a prior right to consideration. Policy, therefore, is interwoven with the whole action of war, and must exercise a continuous influence upon it, as far as the nature of the forces liberated by it will permit. We see, therefore, that war is not merely a political act, but also a real political instrument, a continuation of political commerce, a carrying out of the same by other means. All be. Yon this which is strictly peculiar to war relates merely to the peculiar nature of the means which it uses. That the tendencies and views of policy shall not be incompatible with these means, the art of war in general, and the commander in each particular case may demand, and this claim is truly not a trifling one. But however powerfully this may react on political views in particular cases, still it must always be regarded as only a modification of them, for the political view is the object. War is the means, and the means must always include the object in our conception. In the summer of 1941, the destruction of the Soviet forces was the objective whose attainment would have created the necessary conditions for the realization of the political end, namely Hitler's political intentions. Without question, this objective had not been attained. On the contrary, severe crises had been mastered only with the greatest difficulty and with the loss of virtually placeable manpower and equipment, not to mention the loss of territory. Hitler wanted desperately to regain the initiative in 1942. He initiated the operational thrusts toward Leningrad and the Caucasus on the basis of economic necessity. Thus his ends were not primarily political. Economic considerations instead influenced his selection of military objectives. This could still have been justified à la Clausewitz if the offensives would have permanently weakened the enemy and cost them the war, or, as Clausewitz sets out in Book 8, if the capture of these focal points had created an improved climate for a negotiated peace. But that was far from Hitler's mind. As early as the spring of 1938, General Ludwig Beck, Haider's predecessor as Chief of Staff, had pointed out in a study for Hitler that his policies would inevitably lead to world war involving the United States, and that equally inevitably Germany was bound to emerge as the loser in the conflict, as she simply was not strong enough. This was directly in line with Clausewitz's thinking, that the tendencies and views of policy shall not be incompatible with these means. The art of war in general, and the commander in each particular case may demand. During the planning of the Russian campaign, the commander-in-chief of the army, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, and his chief of staff also expressed to Hitler their concern about launching a campaign with limitless objectives deep into Russia because of the sheer logistical problems, if for no other reason. Hitler, however, was apparently convinced he could smash all Russian resistance within a few weeks. He refused to involve himself in any discussion on the detailed objections raised by his advisers. Even the output of replacement personnel which would have sufficed to replace the losses in a blitzkrieg type of war at most, seemed adequate to Hitler. General Haider's criticisms, which were shared by the commanders of the three army groups, were confirmed only too rapidly by the events in Russia. Despite magnificent achievements and colossal initial victories, the German Wehrmacht was unable to inflict a decisive defeat on the Red Army during the first 1 or 2 months, and the enemy was able to continue his resistance, hurling more and more fresh divisions into the fight. After Moscow recognized that the Japanese were not going to attack Russia in the Far East, a number of Siberian divisions also appeared at key positions along the Eastern Front. The General Staff had planned to direct its main effort against Moscow, as the center of Russian transport communications and political life, which was, of course, a military rather than political objective. But as a result of Hitler's whims, the campaign was diverted in support of army groups north and south. And while this intervention, which deflected southward sections of the main spearheads attacking Moscow, admittedly led to the Great Encircle, meant action at Kiev which yielded some 2 million Russian owners, it contributed little to the main objective of the Russian campaign. Our assault spearheads managed to reach the outskirts of Moscow, but then lacked the strategic and tactical reserves to carry the operation through to final victory. Hitler left nobody in doubt as to the political target he had set himself. He wanted once and for all to liquidate the Bolshevik men, and, as he had already indicated in Mein Kampf, to win the Lebensraum he needed for his people in the East. Obviously, in his public proclamations, he laid greater emphasis on the former argument, and with equal fervor, German propaganda proclaimed the liberation of Russia from communism as the purpose of the war. As I have said, the military command was from the outset skeptical of the prospects of totally smashing the Soviet state with the limited military means at our disposal, even if we were convinced of the superiority of our own personnel. The inadequacy of the means was all too obvious to us. On the other hand, Hitler's pre-war policies had always proved right, and the General Staff's military doubts, based on a cautious appraisal of the situation, had always proved wrong. The occupation of the Rhineland, the annexer, Thun of Austria, the incorporation of the Sudeten territories, Munich, the invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the passive reaction of the Western powers during the Polish campaign, all had proved Hitler right and us wrong. He therefore prohibited the generals, sometimes in abusive language, from voicing political objections. Never had the primacy of politics, and wrong politics at that, been demonstrated more forcefully than during the Third Reich. The military leaders had to bow to Hitler's edicts in 1941. Now, at last, events had proved us right. The political objectives of the campaign, indistinctly formulated as they were, became less and less credible once the military objective, the complete subjugation of the Soviet forces, was not achieved. First the autumn rains, and then the winter laid their unimaginable burdens on our troops, already exhausted by 4 months of fighting. Casualties and equipment losses had long passed a level at which they could be sustained. It was therefore natural that the various branches and sections of the General Staff began to seek ways of salvaging the Soviet campaign. All the discussions came to the same conclusion. A suitable political line must be adopted, which would awaken positive expectations for the future among the Russian peoples and enable us to activate them in the fight against Stalin and his system. Soldiers have often been accused of regarding war as purely military, a matter of guns and bullets. But this is not always the case, for in 1938 Hitler had to complain, "Instead of having to put brakes on my generals, I find I'm having to whip them to go to war." By early 1942, it was clear that the soldiers were increasingly in favor of giving the political element full rein, by formulating appropriate war aims designed to secure the active cooperation of the Russian population. As time passed, moreover, Reichsminister Alfred Rosenberg, who headed the Ministry for Occupied Eastern Territories, showed that he shared our views. Hitler rejected all such suggestions and showed no inclination whatsoever to contemplate a political solution. He was capable of weighing the available means against the end he had set. He opted exclusively for force and led the German people to their ruin in so doing. It was at this time that the propaganda slogan, "Fear a command, suffer us to obey," was modified by public rumour to a bitter parody, "Fire a command, If we obey, we suffer. I would like to stress that it was the soldier, and those in the higher echelons of command were particularly conscious of this, who recognized first that Hitler had wholly surrendered the primacy of politics to the supremacy of the absolute military decision. We believed that political forces should have been brought into play to relieve some of the burden on the fighting man and to inject some kind of political purpose into the campaign against the Soviet Union. This was the only way that might still lead to a satisfactory political end, to collaboration with a Russia liberated from communism and allied by friendship to Germany. There was such a possibility because the Russian people had suffered grievously under the terrors of Stalinism before 1939. I need only recall the purge of the kulaks, the interminable economic chaos, the purges in the Red Army, partly in connection with the Tukhachevsky affair, the decimation of the party's cadre, and the repression of the national minorities. All these were elements in our favour. The persecution of the Russian Christians also left behind permanent and bitter scars on the deeply religious Russian peoples, as we discovered again and again. When Strickfeld Intero gated the son of Stalin soon after his capture, the prisoner told him, "The one thing my father dreads is the emergence of a nationalist regime opposed to him, but that is a step you will never take." The interrogator asked why, and Stalin's son replied, "Because we know you have not set out to liberate our country, but to conquer it." Our troops were celebrated by the Russians everywhere they arrived, whether in the northern or central regions of Russia, in the Ukraine, in Bessarabia or elsewhere. They were greeted by the local population as liberators and garlanded with flowers. Entire Red Army formations of up to regimental and even divisional strength laid down their arms. The numbers of deserters in the first months, quite apart from the millions of prisoners of war, exceeded our wildest expectations. Colonel Herr used to recount how, as acting chief of staff of a mountain corps, he had watched the reactions of the Ukrainian townsfolk to the Germans as liberators from Soviet oppression. Herr had sent on one occasion for the senior town citizen and asked if he could supply a score of able-bodied Russians for guard duties in the motor pool. Within an hour, over 50 Rus, scions had mustered in the school which was his headquarters. As Herr's corps advanced, it adopted this method in every town. In the 3 Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, which had only been occupied by the Russians in 1940. Memories of their own national independence were still quite fresh. Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians had therefore immediately offered help to the German liberating armies, in the hope of thereby restoring their country's independence. Ukrainians, Caucasians, and tribes of Turkish origin believed that in addition to being liberated from Stalin's yoke, they would see their own nationalist aspirations filled, even if these did not always go so far as many of their former leaders, now living in exile, would have liked. After 20 years of arbitrary injustice and terror, the re-establishment of elementary human rights such as the dignity of man, liberty, justice, and the sanctity of property united every inhabitant of the Soviet Empire, insofar as he was not directly working for the Moscow system, in a common readiness to support the Germans. What could be more natural for us than to exploit this readiness? By extending an honest offer to the Russian peoples and foal. Lowing it up in the appropriate way, it would have been possible to unleash a war of liberation which almost certainly would have ended in a rapid and satisfactory conclusion of the Russian campaign. Our military commanders in the field had already made a start in this direction, more from a healthy instinct of self-preserver, than for any political motives. As we could not replace all our losses rapidly, and the endless Russian expanses made increasing demands on our manpower, our commanders recruited Russians, Ukrainians and other nationals as auxiliaries and volunteers for various types of duty. These Hilfswillige voluntarily acted as drivers, ammunition carriers, cooks and interpreters, and the like. The number of such auxiliaries could never be exactly determined, since the individual commanders would frequently avoid reporting precisely how many they had. By mid-1943, however, there were about 320,000, of which a large number were actually fighting alongside our troops. The 18th Army alone had 47,000 Hiwis. In addition, there were other signs of a Russian initiative which we could put to political use against Moscow. In the German-occupied city of Smolensk, for example, a committee of Russians had come together and offered to set up a Russian nationalist government and recruit a Russian army of liberation of about 1 million strong to fight against Stalin. Recognizing that the enemy situation called for a clear overall political line, Field Marshal von Bock and other commanders gave initial support to the Smolensk Committee's proposals. But these proposals were turned down by Hitler, as were similar suggestions put forward by the Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians. Army Group Centre also argued in favour of replacing its personnel deficiencies by recruiting 200,000 Russian auxiliaries. Brauchitsch described this proposal as being of decisive importance, but it was never put into effect, as both he and Bock were relieved of their commands for other reasons in December 1941. I recall having a number of discussions with Hader and other leading general staff officers in the winter of 1941–42. We agreed that there was an urgent necessity for the clear formulation of political war aims, together with a radical alteration in our occupation policies toward the Russian population. Under the pressure of events, the frontline commanders also called for an immediate solution. Those of us directly involved in these discussions anticipated that the worsening military situation would force Hitler to modify his views, and that consequently there would be a change in the current occupation policies. With Hader's approval, we therefore took every step necessary to speed up such a decision. Those of us who were most concerned in this controversy were the heads of the operations branch, Heusinger, of Foreign Armies East, myself, the Quartermaster General, Wagner, and several others. This group's first action was to regularize all the native auxiliary and volunteer units, and to regulate their victualling, pay and position vis-à-vis the German troops. An order was drafted permitting our divisions on the Eastern Front to recruit and feed about 3,000 to 4,000 native auxiliaries each. Previous actions of this kind had resulted from the individual initiative of the field commanders. This was a great help in that while our German personnel losses could never be entirely recouped in quantity or quality, the fighting fitness of the divisions in the front line would remain sufficient to continue the battle, assuming there were a number of changes in our political and military policies. By the beginning of 1942, however, Hitler had still not agreed to modify his political objectives along the lines I have described. Far from it, for by the spring, he had decided on his vast offensive towards the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus, and this had run into strong military opposition, as I have described. If this campaign were to continue, our long supply lines to the front, which had been under constant threat since the winter from partisan warfare, would inevitably become overextended. If the Russians were to make a stand and hold us, we would lose even more men and material. But if the enemy were to withdraw, taking all his forces and equipment with him, we would have to pacify and secure enormous areas. And since the existing Russian population in the areas we occupied continued to outnumber us, this task could be performed only if we could gain their friendship and recruit from among them. In the early summer of 1942, the Russian Lieutenant General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov had fallen into our hands on the east, front near Volkhov. Vlasov was one of the Soviet Army commanders who had successfully defended Moscow against the German onslaught, commanding the 20th Army under Zhukov's overall leadership. Soviet propaganda had made his name and face famous throughout the Red Army, which made what was to follow all the more painful for the Moscow leaders. We soon learned that it was Vlasov's dream to lead a Russian national army of liberation into the Soviet Union. In September 1942, while still a prisoner of war, he put his name to a proclamation released as a leaflet over the Russian lines, appealing to the officers and men of the Red Army. Tens of thousands of them answered the call and surrendered to German units within a few days. All this confirmed just what the Soviet experts of my branch, Foreign Armies East, had reported and suggested to Chief of Staff Hader. Colonel von Rohen's group, particularly Captain Strickfeld, contributed most to these suggestions. The success of the Vlasov proclamation was not without its impact on the senior officers who had at first been somewhat reserved toward this approach. Thus, the conviction grew that General Vlasov, who certainly never went out of his way to flatter the Germans and never left any doubt but that he was collaborating with us only for the sake of Russian national independence, might be the man to fight for and build a new and different Russia with German aid. I later met him myself. He made a very forthright and reliable impression. His voice was firm and clear, and his language betrayed a fine intellect. Above all, his military ability was testified to by his experience in the battles for Kiev and Moscow. Hitler, however, lacked all sense of reality. He was either unable or unwilling to deviate from his faulty political and military intentions for the conduct of the Russian campaign. Neither Haider nor Zeitzler was able to change his views. Hitler saw Vlasov at most as a propaganda tool to weaken the Soviet armed forces. Promises might be given to him and to deserters who came over to join him, but on no account should these promises be kept. The German officers who negotiated with Vlasov faithfully reported Hitler's attitude to him, but they nevertheless persisted in their efforts to make common cause with him in fighting both Stalin and the ignorance of the Nazi leaders, as they believed this to be the quickest route to peace and the ultimate liberation of the Russian peoples. After much hesitation, and despite overwhelming doubts, Vlasov agreed. From this alliance between German and Russian officers, there emerged what was to become known as the Vlasov movement. The movement was only one tragic stone in the mosaic of the war, and it is a matter for conjecture whether, had it flourished, it could have saved Germany from the ultimate total defeat once the United States was ready to intervene in strength. Vlasov was transferred to the High Command, OKW, in Berlin in October 1942, and shortly thereafter released from prisoner of war status. He was given the opportunity to collect a staff of fellow workers. Hitler had placed no restriction on this OKW propaganda effort, since one of the slogans under which the Russian campaign had been launched was already the liberation of the Russian peoples. The German field commands and the Russians themselves had at first believed in this slogan until early in 1943, when they found out how wide was the gulf between propaganda and reality. From this propaganda headquarters, Vlasov and his staff were able to appeal to the Russian population on both sides of the front line, to the public, the volunteers, the prisoners of war, and the Eastern Work, EERs, some 80 million people all told. We received the clearest indications that even the Soviet Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky was only awaiting the right moment to come out openly against the Stalin regime. It looked like a tremendous step in the right direction. When we approached the Foreign Ministry with our view that the war could be won only if the Russian people actively threw in their lot with us, Count von der Schulenburg, our former ambass. Sador in Moscow and his councillor Gustav Hilger took up the cause and championed our proposals. However, they encountered either complete lack of sympathy or a paralytic terror of taking anything that was without the permission of Ribbentrop and Hitler, let alone anything diametrically opposing their orders. At the same time, both Colonel von Altenstadt of the Corps, Termaster General's branch, and I drew up studies stressing the necessity of psychological and political warfare in the East. We called for new methods of dealing with the partisan plague. The studies were highly praised and widely discussed, and entirely without effect. Hitler personally issued orders for the ruthless liquider, Tyon of all partisans, regardless of whether they were willing to surrender or desert to us or not. These orders resulted in a further escalation of the partisan conflict and a renewed embitterment of the population toward everything German. Strickfeld delivered a lecture entitled The Russian Character, which, in contrast to Hitler's views, must have appeared almost revolutionary, but I had it duplicated and distributed to every division on the Eastern Front and to the prison camps, which came under the Quartermaster General as well. The document called for an understanding of the Russian mentality, and its general tenor was that the Russian must be won over for our cause. If we could not win him, we would have to rule by brute force. If we were to win him, we must set an X, ample in word and deed. This was, of course, all aimed primarily at the eyes and ears of our German troops. In the autumn of 1942, Colonel Stief and Major Count von Stauffenberg of our organization branch approved the activation of a Russian propaganda section. Thus, there was officially born the Russian Leadership Center at Dabendorf, a prison camp south of Berlin, ostensibly still purely a propaganda exercise. There, Russian officers and propaganda workers were trained, a skeleton officer corps was established, and Russian newspapers were printed. There also, in conjunction with the OKW's military propaganda unit and Foreign Armies East, the political and military objectives for a Russian liberation movement were worked out. At the suggestion of the head of the operations branch, an official command post of General in Command of Volunteer Units was activated by Haider in conjunction with his organization branch under Stauffenberg. The first incumbent was General Heinz Helmich, who had been in Rus-Sian captivity in World War I. His successor was General Kostring. As a result of the work of these various officers, of Vlasov's own work, and the initiative of our frontline commanders in the East, by early 1943 we had between 130,000 and 150,000 East earned troops, organized into 176 battalions and 38 independent companies. At that time, as a result of a policy decision higher up, there was no amalgamation of these into larger formations. See the chart on page 86 for a breakdown of our Eastern troops as of early 1943. As early as August 1942, von Rohen and Colonel von Tresckow, Chief of Staff of Army Group Center, had decided to resuscitate the Smolensk Committee. But when Hitler heard of it, he forbade the plan, and the committee was permitted to exist as a fictional body only. Vlasov's staff and the OKW's military propaganda section drew up a proclamation for the Smolensk Committee, and this was signed by Vlasov and General Vasily Malishkin at the end of October 1942, ready to be broadcast in millions of leaflets on both sides of the Russian lines as the Stalingrad battle approached its terrible climax. The proclamation moulded for many months in a drawer in Rosen, Berg's ministry, and does not appear to have been brought to Rosenberg's attention until the disaster of Stalingrad was over. Not until February 12, 1943, did he authorize its distribution, and that same evening, Captain von Grothe ordered the printing of the millions of leaflets. This lack of action wrecked the General Staff's plan to test the effect of coupling military and political initiative in the Caucasus campaign. Under the pressure of military events, we did finally succeed in forcing a conference at Rosenberg's ministry in December 1942 to discuss the whole problem. The Wehrmacht was represented in strength at the conference and spoke out unmistakably for completely new political objectives in Russia. Most of them seemed to believe that Rosenberg, a Baltic German, was himself the father of Hitler's Russian policies. Rosenberg was clearly impressed by what he heard at the conference and promised to support these proposals to Hitler, although he was still unwilling to deviate from some of his own ideas, which tended toward dividing the Soviet Union into separate national entities such as the Ukraine. Rosenberg's subsequent discussion with Hitler was a complete failure, as Hitler waved aside all his arguments with a few well-chosen and final words. Colonel Martin, head of the OKW military propaganda section, persuaded Goebbels to agree to a meeting with Vlasov to discuss a new manifesto composed for the Russian peoples. Goebbels had already recognized that the menacing trend in the war demanded nothing short of an about-face in the Third Reich's attitude toward Russia. It was characteristic of the petty jealousies prevalent at the top that Rosenberg now flatly forbade Goebbels to interfere in his affairs. And by the time Vlasov finally saw Goebbels, it was already 1945, and much too late. In the spring of 1943, General Vlasov visited the Eastern Front at the suggestion of foreign armies east. At the end of February, he paid a 2-week visit to units of Army Group Center, and in April he spent some days with Army Group North. He made speeches to the Russian battalions and to the local Russian population, and was received everywhere with open arms. After many grim experiences, the Russians now saw in him the only token of a future freedom, the guarantee of a better future. They no longer trusted the Germans as they had a year before. Keitel, however, found Vlasov's brazen conduct in delivering speeches outlining Russian nation. Holistic policies quite intolerable. On April 18th, he ordered Vlasov's return to prison camp and threatened that if he continued his conduct, he would be turned over to the Gestapo. We managed to prevent the worst excesses against him, and it was all we could do to salvage the beginnings we had made with our Russian liberation movement. We had managed to convince General Zeitzler that our ideas were right, and he approved a major propaganda operation designed to step up the Russian desertion rate at the same time as we launched our next big offensive, Operation Citadel. We codenamed the opera Tion Silver Lining, and trained 1,500 officers and propaganda workers specially for it at the Dabendorf training camp. A key element of the operation was that the deserters had to be welcomed where possible by Russian reception teams. A special leaflet was designed with a facsimile of my signature, instructing all our troops to treat deserters particularly well and find out if they wished to join the Russian Liberation Army. Citadel was planned to commence at dawn on May 6th, so on the evening of May 3rd, we issued the code word Silver Lining. The 18 million leaflets were to be released over Russian lines as the offensive began. There was a last-moment panic when we learned that Silver Lining was a long-existing Luftwaffe code word for commencing poison gas warfare, but this caused no real problems. As it turned out, Citadel was postponed for 2 months, and our Silver Lining operation, which began without the accompanying military offensive on the night of May 6th, went off at half-cock. It resulted in hundreds of deserters, but not the many thousands we had confidently expected. When Hitler learned that the Russian nationalist policies propagated by Vlasov were threatening to get a firm foothold among the Russian auxiliaries aiding the German cause, he called a conference with Keitel and Zeitzler on June 8, 1943, at the Berghof in Berchtesgaden, and destroyed all our hopes. "One thing has to be prevented," said Hitler, "that anybody on our own side gets any wrong ideas. We have to draw a clear distinction between the propaganda we broadcast to the other side and what we really propose to do." Hitler persisted in his stubborn opposition to the plan for a real army of Russian troops under Vlasov's command, and he prohibited any concrete promises to them on the future of Russia after the German victory he even now expected. He permitted the FAN, Tom Propaganda Army, using Vlasov's name, to march on for propaganda reasons, and we could tell how much anxiety this caused Moscow, for we rounded up many Soviet agents parachuted behind our lines with explicit orders to infiltrate that army at all costs and to bring Vlasov back dead or alive into communist hands. Moscow produced several anti-Vlasov leaflets, but faced with the dilemma of releasing them by the million from the air and giving Vlasov still wider publicity in the Soviet forces, they chose instead to have squads of agents in key areas distribute them by hand. In the end, Vlasov was denied success. We had sensed from the autumn of 1943 onward that the Russian liberation movement was at an end. Hitler decided to disarm all the foreign units and turn them over to the Labour Service, alleging that their desertion rate was too high. Within a few days, Colonel Herer, who had been appointed Chief of Staff to the General of Volunteer Units, countered Hitler's order with clear proof that the accusations levelled at his volunteers were untrue. The desertion rate was no greater than in any German unit, he pointed out, and he stated that there was nothing out of the ordinary that could have justified Hitler's order. Against this had to be set the fact that in view of the military and logistics problems, any dissolution of the foreign units would have catastrophic consequences for the German Eastern Front. Even Keitel showed he had doubts in this respect. In mid-October, the decision was modified so that the foreign units were instead transferred to the Western Front, and Hitler waived the order that they were to be disarmed by force. This decision of Hitler's proved once again his inability to understand warfare as Clausewitz did. Through this order, the General Staff lost its sole means of introducing psychological warfare into the conflict on the Eastern Front. The transfer of the foreign units to the Western Front from the end of 1943 onward was further proof of the insincerity and hollowness of Hitler's Ostpolitik. In any case, since he had not managed to persuade our allies, the Italians, Romanians and Hungarians, to defend their fatherlands on the Don and the Volga, how could he expect the Caucasians to light any better if they were assigned to the Atlantic Wall? They rightly interpreted this as a lack of confidence in their reliability and as proof that the Germans lacked the will to cooperate with them. From early 1944 onward, we had other worries on our minds. Himmler and his SD began to take an interest in the Vlasov move, Ment. He sensed in this movement a rival to the non-German Divi, scions of the Waffen-SS, the so-called volunteer divisions. Above all, he saw it as an obstacle to his plans to settle and administer a Slav colonial empire in the future. All this meant that Foreign Armies East, the OKW's military propaganda section, and the Abwehr frequently had to restrain the SS from interfering. A veritable war broke out on several fronts, which was ultimately at the expense of our effort in the East. Himmler's attitude unexpectedly changed in August 1944. Unabashed by the fact that he was the brain behind the subhuman theories of the Third Reich, and that the year before he had still referred to General Vlasov as a traitor and a Russian swine. The rapidly deteriorating war situation now forced Himmler to adopt the exact line that my staff and I had long been preaching, and which the SD had fought against tooth and nail. Despite Rosenberg's protests, in which Rosenberg had the support of Keitel, Himmler sanctioned the creation of a Committee for the Liberation of the Russian Peoples, with General Vlasov at its head. At first, he promised the general 10 divisions under his direct command. The figure was later reduced to 3. Himmler also undertook to raise the status of Russian prisoners and the Eastern workers within the Reich to the same level as those of other nationalities. But this was all happening far too late. Born of opportunism and despair, the Vlasov army was doomed to failure from the start. On February 10, 1945, the first 2, and only 2 Russian infantry divisions, numbers 600 and 650, were formally handed over to Lieutenant General Vlasov by General Kostring, who had succeeded Helmich as general of the volunteer units. The ceremony was attended by SS officials and party representatives, and by Colonel Herrer on my behalf. The Russian flag was hoisted next to our own, and these divisions' arduous path into their fatherland began. Vlasov's attempt to salvage them from the ruins of the Reich and to transfer them to the Western Allies were thwarted by the Allies themselves, since the Yalta Agreement bound all belligerents to surrender Allied prisoners to their countries of origin. Thus, he and his followers found themselves treading the bitter road into imprisonment, and eventually onto the gallows of their own country, which they had wanted to liberate from the yoke of Stalinism. If I survey the tragedy of the Vlasov movement now, after an interval of 25 years or more, I am bound to admit that, given Hitler's manic ideas, the movement was doomed to failure from the start. All the effort Germans and Russians alike had invested in the movement had been for nothing. For countless Russians and their friends, like General von Panwitz, one of the divisional commanders, it meant being branded as traitors. The lesson I learned was that the psychopolitical element cannot be suppressed in modern politics or warfare, and if it is not promptly and completely taken into account, or if the nature of modern war is misunderstood, then however great the means that are provided by a country for its armed forces, they will be wasted, and all sacrifice will be in vain. While Clausewitz could write of war as a continuation of politics by other means, Lenin followed this dictum with a rider of his own. Peace is only a continuation of war by other means. Politicians are not the only ones whom this concerns, but officers as well. And they should not just take an interest in the political implications once armed conflict has actually broken out, but during the years of peace that precede the conflict,